1. The events of this story happened about a few weeks ago. I volunteer at a hospital a few blocks away from the college I attend twice a week. And it's located in a pretty bad neighborhood that's no stranger to muggings, stabbings, drug deals. You know, those kinds of crimes. During the day it isn't too bad, but at night, you generally want to walk as quickly as possible when you're going somewhere. There's a guy who hangs around the neighborhood who has quite the reputation of conning people out of money. I see him across the street every day on my way to work, but I never had a personal encounter with him. One volunteer I work with who lives in the area with her mother told me that he's notorious for making up fake sob stories about how he lost his job, can't pay his rent, can't afford a bus fare, or any kind of story to get him some money. She told me he lives with his cousin and he blows every dollar he has on booze and drugs. Once I finished my shift, I went to the volunteer room to grab my stuff and head back to my dorm. Now I wore a light black hoodie that had two guys from Daft Punk and their logo on the back of my hoodie. This will factor in momentarily. I walked out of the building and put my hood up as it was raining a bit, and by the time I left it was about 7 at night. I walked about a block down the road when I see the guy cross the street and he approaches me. He says, "Yo man, can you help a brother out? My daughter needs a new pair of shoes and I can't afford them. Can you please spare some money?" I actually didn't have any cash on me, so I wasn't lying when I told him I had no money on me. He started telling me that I had to have cash on me, and to please have a heart and give him money for his daughter's shoes. I apologized and told him once again I had no money to spare. I walked across the street away from him, and this is when things start going south. He starts screaming, "You fucking liar! You're fucking loaded! I see what you're wearing! That must have cost you a fortune!" Is he serious right now? This hoodie only cost me like $15 off Amazon, and besides, I already told him I had no money. Why couldn't he just bother somebody else? He continued to follow me, ranting and raving about how rich people like me spit in the faces of poor people like him, and can't even lend a hand in their time of need. This continued for about a block until I finally had it and screamed at him to leave me alone. He just stood there looking angry, and he attempted to throw a punch at me. I moved back, avoiding it. But then he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me towards him. I punched him in the stomach, and he let go of me. I began running away from him, and he started chasing me. I turned onto a busy block, hoping he would leave me alone. But it didn't seem to deter him at all. He continued chasing me, yelling about how he's gonna teach my rich ass a lesson about charity. My heart was racing pretty fast, and I felt like I was running on autopilot. Police officers patrol this road quite a bit, so I was hoping one would pass by and see this guy chasing me, but it looked like I was extremely unlucky that day. I was trying to think of a way to shake him, with my mind racing in all directions, when my luck finally shot up. I managed to dart across the street where the light was about to turn green. I kept running, and I heard the sound of a car horn and screeching of the brakes. I looked back to see him getting up off the sidewalk, so I believe he must have jumped back to avoid getting hit by the car. He just stood there staring at me, and gave me the middle finger and walked away. I didn't stop running though, and I continued to run for another block before I finally stopped. I leaned up against the lamppost to catch my breath, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. What was wrong with this guy? Why couldn't he just go bother somebody else for money? Why did he attempt to assault me? Why was he chasing after me? I felt more angry than scared, to be honest. I was pissed about what he had tried to pull. Instead of going to campus straight away, I went to the precinct and filed a report on him. Apparently, they told me this wasn't the first time he tried assaulting and harassing somebody on the street. and that they were working on getting him into custody. I started taking a different route to work after that, and I never personally saw him again, so I don't know if he was arrested or not. But what I do know is that I never want to meet him again. 2. A little backstory in order for all this to make a bit more sense. I used to live in New York City in a tiny apartment full of 6 other people and me, so 7 in total. We dubbed ourselves the Team. I was the youngest at 19 years old, and was treated like the little sister as everyone else was aged 26 to 35. I'm also pretty tiny at 5'2", and not even 115 pounds soaking wet. This particular instance involved my giant 6'5" weightlifter roommate from Africa that I called Moo. During the summer, I worked at a little hole-in-the-wall coffee shop on the Upper East Side. Contrary to popular belief, the highest crime rate was in the Upper East Side, and not in Harlem or the Bronx. I would close on a few nights out of the week with another worker that absolutely hated my guts. Her name was Fatima. I only agreed to close on the night that she worked late, because I got to bring home the bagels that didn't sell and would otherwise be thrown out. On my walk home, it was about a 30-minute walk, I would give a bag of bagels to a nice homeless man. I called him Bagel Guy, and he called me Coffee Girl. Here's where the story starts. Earlier in the day that I closed with my co-worker Fatima, a man had come in and ordered coffee, which isn't unusual in itself because, well, I worked in a coffee shop. What made him stand out was that I had never seen him before, and neither had my co-worker. The coffee shop was one of those places with regulars that would have their order being made the second they step in the door, and everyone knew everyone by name or at least recognized each other. I brushed it off as maybe he was exploring or had recently moved into the area. But as the line steadily shrunk, I was noticing that he was staring bullets at me. At first I wasn't too worried, after all I lived in New York City, and there were an overly fair amount of awkward and unusual characters. Only this guy was blatantly staring bullets at me to the point that I could feel his eyes on me when I turned around to grab people's orders. When it was his turn to order, I mentioned that I hadn't seen him in the shop before, and he replied that he had stopped in because he saw me in the window. Again, it's New York City, people do weird shit. He ordered and paid, but he kept hanging around the counter trying to get my attention and talk to me. I'd politely tell him that I was busy and he'd need to grab a seat or clear out because I needed to work. Mind you, this place was literally like a closet. The only people that would ever sit at the 2.5 tables we had were the guy that cleaned and ran our pickups, or one of the 3 people that had been coming to the shop since the beginning of time. This strange guy hung around nearly all day, sometimes outside or at the table when a seat was available. But he was never out of sight for more than 30 to 45 minutes. I was starting to get weirded out to the point that I voluntarily talked to Fatima, and she despised me. So much so to the point that she'd yell at me in front of customers and complain loudly to the managers about me. I told her about the weird guy and how he'd been bugging me all day, and didn't listen when I told him he couldn't just loiter. Fatima told me to shut up, and she didn't care. When closing time came, we'd usually be done around 11:30 p.m. to midnight. I was tasked with going to grab our little sign and bench that we had outside. I go out, and guess who's there? Weirdo creepy guy. I tell him that we are closing and I needed to bring the bench inside. He complies, gets off the bench, and walks off. I watch him turn the corner at the end of the street, but I'm still weirded out. I mention it to Fatima and ask her if she'd stay with me because I want to have my roommate Moo come get me. And she tells me she doesn't care and to shut up. I grab my bags of leftover bagels and she locks up and jets out of there towards one of the subway stations uptown. My apartment was downtown, so I couldn't walk with her. As I'm walking, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. I decided to turn quickly and without warning to see if I am, I was being followed. Every time I'd turn around, the guy would quickly try to hide in a doorway, like the stereotypical creeper in a movie does, doubling back, switching avenues, and trying to lose him by hiding in groups of people didn't help. I know many people are going to think, why didn't I call someone? My hands were full, and I was trying not to trip or panic. Remember Bagel Guy? This is where he makes an appearance. I'd always bring him bagels, and we'd have a chat. I finally reach where Bagel Guy usually is, and say hi and hand him his share of bagels. I tell him that I'm being followed, and tell him that he's hiding badly in the doorway. Bagel Guy sees Creepy Guy, and tells me to stay where I am, and call someone. Moo was the only person I could reach. I had acted like my phone had rang, and kind of talked in shorthand to him about Creep, and that I was with Bagel Guy. Moo was still a ways downtown, but said that he was hurrying. I asked Bagel Guy if he'd walk with me to meet my roommate, because I was scared out of my mind, and he agreed and said it was no problem. We start our walk downtown towards my roommate. And the whole time the creeper guy is still following me. He's even doing the whole horribly fail at trying to hide shtick, but he's getting closer and closer every time we turn to look. There's still no sign of Moo, and I want to cry. Finally, we see a beast of a man just barreling towards us, and I immediately recognize it as Moo. I guess he had seen the guy following me and now Bagel Guy, because Moo doesn't stop as he reaches us, he just kept on running. Bagel Guy and I decide to jog towards where Moo was headed, and I was glad I did. When Moo reached the creep, he shoved him against the wall of where he was hiding, and confronted the guy about following his little sister. I guess I should make note that I look nothing like Moo. The creep guy is now the one scared out of his mind, as he has a 6'5" ripped guy that is nearly breathing fire at him. Moo threatens the guy that if he catches him following us after this, or following me or coming to the coffee shop, that the creep is going to regret it. I was a little taken aback. Moo is a giant teddy bear. But he is not someone you want to be on the bad side of. After Moo is done scaring the guy, he thanks Bagel Guy multiple times for watching out for me, and hopes that he enjoys his bagels. Then Moo and I go home, and I was never bothered by that creep again. 3. I should reference I am a 25-year-old female, and I suffer from really severe anxiety and panic attacks on the regular. I have been through a few scary experiences that have caused my anxiety to flare up, but recently, it's been really bad. When I was in middle school, I was walking home from my bus stop, when I see my neighbor outside ushering me into her house. Trusting her, as I was friends with her children, I went in. As I started to walk into her house, I looked over at mine, and saw some asshole taking my bike and riding off with it. I looked at her and she told me she heard noises coming from my house, and saw no one was home, so she called out, but no one answered. My mum was at work and my brother was at detention, so it was just me coming home. She called my mom, and she came home with the cops. The house was completely destroyed. All of my mom's jewelry was gone, my laptop was gone, my brother's game console was gone. The cops asked if I could identify the individual, but I couldn't. I didn't realize what was happening at the time. I was almost in my driveway before my neighbor rushed over to get me. I was 10 seconds away from walking into a home invasion, and that haunted me for a while. That's just the first story, though that has caused my fear of being home alone. See, my boyfriend is in another state right now because his grandfather passed away. I stayed home because we have a few pets, and I couldn't get the time off work. When I'm alone, I get very spooked at every noise. It also doesn't help that I have a cat, and cats, being cats, are interested in every squirrel that's outside. So when she'd run to the window, I would follow after her just to see what she is going after. When I was a sophomore in high school, there were people breaking into houses around the town I live in. The town I lived in was full of old money, or as my grandfather called them, soup eaters. Because they'd spent so much money on making their appearance look good, they must not be able to eat. Anyway, I wasn't too worried about it because these break-ins were happening on the very rich side of town, not mine. This was also a very safe town, about an hour south of Boston, and no newsworthy crimes at all. Actually, the worst crime before the break-ins were always just some teenagers caught with weed. I was alone at night, with my then boyfriend. We were watching TV in my living room, which was in the back of my house. So I couldn't see who pulled into the driveway, or who even came into the house. I could hear the door when it would open, and that's how I knew someone was home. I specifically remember we were watching The 40-Year-Old Virgin, because that's one of my favorite movies. Outside of the living room window, we had some bushes that grew very thick and tall in the summer. I remember I heard one of them scratch the window screen, but figured it was just the wind, and went back to watching the movie. We had the blinds closed since it was dark outside, and I never liked having them open, with the fear that I was being watched. I then hear someone walking up my porch at the front door. Thinking it was just my mom and her boyfriend coming back from their date, I didn't pay much attention to it, until I noticed no one has come inside yet. We then heard the doorknob start to turn very slowly. My then boyfriend muted the movie while we stared at each other, not sure what we were hearing. We then hear another pair of footsteps coming up the porch and slight whispers, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I then decided I would go and check it out since he seemed to have been paralyzed by fear and would be useless in this situation. To get to the door, you have to go through the kitchen, which is attached to the front door. I had all the lights off and very slowly and quietly went into the kitchen to peek out one of the windows. I then saw two males at my front door trying to pick the lock to get into my house. I quickly grabbed the steak knife and crouched down behind the kitchen table. There was a sliding door behind me with no curtain though, since our new kitten had clawed it down and destroyed it. So it was not a very good place to hide, since all you had to do was walk up the stairs to our back porch and see right into my kitchen, half the house, and me with my back turned. I could still hear whispers, and then heard one of the men walk off the front porch. I slowly started to stand up and go over to the front door when I heard someone walking up my back porch to try to get into the sliding glass door. I was stuck. There was no way I was getting out of this without being seen. My then boyfriend was just looking at me with fear from the living room, no help at all. I quickly texted my mother and her boyfriend in a group chat, saying that there are two men trying to get into the house. She told me to go upstairs and into her bedroom and lock the door. She said they were calling the cops and they'll be back soon. I tried my hardest to gain the courage to get out of my hiding spot, get the useless boyfriend and run upstairs, but I got angry. For some reason I wasn't scared anymore. I was just really fucking pissed off. To this day I don't know what came over me. These people were trying to break into my house, where I had always felt safe. I knew that no one was going to protect me, and I was going to have to do it on my own. I stood up from my hiding spot and turned on all the lights in the kitchen. That's when I saw one of the men opening up the glass sliding door. I guess it was never locked. I looked over at him with my knife and said, "Get the fuck out of my house or I will slit your fucking throat." He then bolted down the stairs and I went to my front door. I saw the man who was trying to break into the front door start running with his friend out of my driveway. Next thing I know, I see my mom's car, my mom's boyfriend's car, and the police speeding into the driveway, and I was outside holding a huge kitchen knife. The cops opened their doors and told us to get inside, and they checked the surrounding areas. We went inside, and all my mom's boyfriend would say is, "You're as white as a ghost, what happened, honey?" My mom was in tears, hugging me, and I was in a state of shock. The cops came into our house and, sadly, didn't find the two men. but they did have one of their footprints from the back door, since he had walked through some mud. The lock to my front door was damaged, and he almost made it inside. I didn't realize what came over me, nor did I realize what I even said until the police were taking my statement, and that's when the fear came back. I was no longer angry, but horrified. I started crying hysterically, realizing what had just happened. They never caught the two men, but from what I know, there were no more break-ins in my neighborhood. Before I moved in with my now boyfriend, my mom, who would work overnights at the hospital, and my brother, who'd work overnights at a retailer, would always ask me if I was okay staying home alone. I moved out when I was 23, so I always said, "Yeah, Mom, don't worry, I'll be fine." But if I'm alone, I still sleep with all the lights on, and a steak knife under my pillow. 2 break-ins that I was there for have honestly traumatized me. Hey everybody, HellFreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 249. Happy New Year to you all, I hope you had a nice one. I want to apologise for the lack of videos in recent times. Sadly, we're not back to normal. I'm not back to normal. Not even close, but I do have to keep working nonetheless, so I'll try and get videos out whenever I'm able to. And with that, I'm not going to yammer on too much, so I just wanted to thank you all for your support during this very difficult time for me. Hopefully it eases soon, but we'll see how things go. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.